Good morning, everyone. Do you think my hair is growing in curly? I can't tell. Sometimes it looks like it might be. It's wild. I do know that. But, you know, who would it be if my hair wasn't wild as well as everything else? It has to be consistent with everything, right? We wouldn't want it to be tame now, would we? I didn't sleep great last night, but I'm up. I'm here. So, how'd you sleep? Hopefully better than I did. Today, our topic is about the abuse of power and generational trauma. I went back, actually. This is our 25th Jesus Bubble together through this book. And I went back and I put the topics in the descriptions of every one coming up to now. So hopefully that'll help you if you want to go back and you're trying to look for one specific one, and then you don't have to be like, what was her hair doing that day and which number was it? Anyway, so we're on page 111 in the book, which is Redeeming Power by Diane Langberg. Good morning, Leah and Amy and whoever else is on here whose names I haven't seen pop up yet, but I know there's more people than that. And Patrice, nice to see you guys this morning. Where are you tuning in from? And is it really freakishly early, or are you further later than I am? Hi, Julie. All right, you guys got your books? If you don't, that's fine too. Just listen along. The abuse of power and generational trauma. Do we really think we can enslave millions of people for more than 200 years, treating them as things to be used, crushing, oppressing, and humiliating them, without long-term effects reverberating throughout the generations descended from both slaves and slaveholders? And we know the trauma and abuse did not stop with slavery. While about 4 million enslaved people in the United States were freed in 1863, our nation proceeded to crush African Americans with Jim Crow laws. Many fled north. In Isabel Wilkerson's excellent book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, we read, blacks, though native-born, were arriving as the poorest people from the poorest section of the country with the least access to the worst education. Read it again. Let it sink in. Though native-born, blacks were arriving as the poorest people from the poorest section of the country with the least access to the worst education. My hope is that we will see more clearly the overwhelming results of trauma echoing down through the centuries. Trauma is a wound to personhood, to the self, a deep wound with a profound impact. Trauma shapes us. We have been created in the image of a God who speaks, relates, and has power. Trauma isolates, silences, and renders powerless. That which mars God's image is not of God. This fact is very important to me as a clinician. The people I see, like all of us, are easily shaped. So what happens when children, the most malleable of humans, are repeatedly imprinted with evil? I suspect most of us have some aware of our family histories. There are some exceptions, and the blankness of that space carries its own wounds. Some of us have family stories that instill dignity and pride. Others carry family stories like a burden, heavy with shame and sadness. It is likely that most of us have some of both. We have all been shaped by what has been passed down through the generations. The concept of concentration camp syndrome or survivor syndrome emerged in the 1960s, noticed and then labeled by clinicians in Canada who were seeing the children of Holocaust survivors seeking mental health treatment. Further down the line, the grandchildren of those survivors were overrepresented by 300% in referrals as compared to the general population. At first, the children were described as having secondary trauma. But when the same symptoms were evident in the third generation, we began to recognize what is now called the intergenerational transmission of trauma. The phrase refers to trauma that occurred several generations ago and its impact on each new generation psychologically, neurobiologically, and culturally. Behavioral and emotional responses to past trauma continue to shape the experiences of the present generation. We can see, if we will just look, the tragic suffering and evil that result when humans are traumatized. We once thought of trauma as an event resulting in distressed humans showing certain symptoms. That can certainly still be true. We now recognize, however, that trauma can be a multifaceted, enduring part of life, resulting in long-term damage to body, mind, heart, and soul. It is crucial in our desire to relieve suffering and speak truth that we have some understanding of the nature of trauma and its effects, as well as how the transmission of generational trauma works, so that our dialogues and our care of others are based on some grasp of that reality. Excuse me. We tend to minimize or dismiss such damage to make it feel more manageable to us. A person is altered and shaped by chronic, complex trauma and oppression. The impact is mistrust, hopelessness, shame, and inferiority with no sense of ability or choice. This person has no sense of self or identity. This is who I choose to be. And no integrity of the self. They are isolated with no experience of love, no safety in relationships, and no sense of purpose except, perhaps, survival. Despair, hopelessness, and lack of purpose are predominant. You can take an adult with a relatively healthy childhood and an intact self and throw them into an Auschwitz, a Pitești prison, or a Tuol sling. You can put them on a ship, drag them away from home and enslave them, or you can remove them from their land, take their children, destroy all they hold dear, so traumatizing them that their former identities and structures of self are dismantled and crushed. They cannot recover from such events in a year or so. These experiences have been woven into them and have shaped their I am. An entirely different person now hands down to future generations what has been burned into their soul. Talk about power. Both the individual story and the story of the people group get told over and over. These stories, like the original events of which they tell, continue to shape future generations. The restoration of beauty. With those stories in mind, think of a favorite painting that is beautiful and worth a great deal of money. Maybe it's in a museum or a private collection. Perhaps it is a Rembrandt or a Van Gogh. Whenever there is news about damage done to such a painting, people around the world respond with distress. A beautiful masterpiece created by an artist who is gone. Kind of like people felt about Notre Dame when there was the fire. All around the world. A treasure mutilated and treated as if it had no value. Some who love art weep at such news. Every human being is one of God's masterpieces. No two are alike. Each one is unique, but all are created by the same artist. All are treasured by him and meant to bless others. All are signed with his name, coming directly from God's hand. They carry the master's image. They are gifts of beauty for all to see and enjoy. Destruction of such beauty is tragic. When we oppress, enslave, keep under, silence, demean, eliminate, or ostracize other human beings, we are trashing the exquisite artwork of our God. Listen to God speak. Micah 3:9-11. You who have authority, who abhor justice and make crooked all that is right, who build with bloodshed and unrighteousness, your leaders work for money, yet they say, is not the Lord among us? Is this not a description of slavery? Was not slavery sanctioned by such passages? What about lynching, that grisly public spectacle of dehumanization by which people were killed and soul damage was done to their families and to all African Americans? It was also destructive to those doing the lynching, the crowds who came to watch, and the powers that sanctioned such devastation. Does the passage not also describe the treatment of indigenous peoples, the internment of Japanese Americans, the genocides, and many other atrocities around the world? Do we not see that we are destroying not only humans created by God, but also ourselves when we use power to engage in such evils actively or passively? If we do not face the truth and truly repent, we will have to harden ourselves and repeatedly call evil good, passing such lies down to future generations. The stench of death is still with us. Can you imagine the weeping our God has done and continues to do across the centuries as we have destroyed masterpieces of his creation? We, as his people, need to learn to watch with him, to weep with him. When we do this, in the words of a genocide survivor in Rwanda who lived through unspeakable atrocities and trauma, here is what happens. I saw only evil. I no longer believed God to be good. The church was not a sanctuary for my family, it was a cemetery. But then you came, you listened, and you heard my broken heart. And now I think I can believe that God too is listening and hears my pain and will be my sanctuary because I have gotten a taste of him through you. This is what it looks like to use power in the midst of atrocity to bless others. We can only bless this way when we view humans as God does. God became flesh and has shown us what is good. And what does he require of us? But to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with the servant of man. The fragrance of the servant is the only antidote to the stench of death. I've been thinking about this a lot in trauma parenting. When we have experienced trauma and we want to break those cycles with our children, it is absolutely important to remember that when we are interacting with our children, we are looking into the face of God. I don't mean that we worship or idolize our children. I mean that our children are made in God's image, just as we are. And as we communicate with our children and teach our children and correct and discipline our children and love on our children and deal with conflicts with our children, we are looking into the face of God. It's a good recalibrator. And the same with anyone who looks different than us, who speaks differently than us, whose skin is a different color than yours or mine, whose culture is different. And I do not mean this in a way of excusing someone who is harming. That is not the point of this. We're talking about sitting with those who have been harmed. And also recognizing that the most loving thing to do for someone who is harming others is to call them to accountability and to stand up against it. Because that is what can potentially bring them to a better understanding of their own damage done. All right, I'm not going to editorialize today. There's just so much heavy stuff in that chapter to chew on. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How does this strike you? Does this, I know that the conversation of race and slavery and ethnicity and nationalism and patriotism and generational history and so on, it's so very fraught with volatility for so many. There are deep, deep emotions on every side, and I want to be very sensitive and tender to those. How does this book's approach to the topic strike you differently than the typical conversations that you may have seen or heard or participated in on other platforms and in other places. I would love to hear your thoughts and have dialogue underneath this video in that same tone, in that same desire to see the face of God in each other, regardless of where we come from or what we have endured or what generational trauma cycles we are seeking to shatter, to give our own children a better future. All right, talk to me. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you love this, hit share and send it on to someone else. Have a great day.